Look down at the bare skin on your arm right now.
Like, just take a second and really look at it. Notice how thin it is. Notice the complete lack of dense fur.
Yeah, it's pretty glaring when you actually focus on it.
Right. Now, I want you to mentally strip away every modern comfort surrounding you. No house, no walls,
Yeah.
no synthetic winter coat hanging by the door.
And no heater quietly humming in the background.
Exactly. Imagine standing naked in a flat, white wasteland where the air is, I don't know, -30 degrees, and the wind is just uninterrupted for hundreds of miles.
In that kind of environment, your biology is essentially a ticking clock.
Yeah, within minutes, the blood aggressively retreats from your extremities. Within an hour, your core temperature plummets.
And in a few hours, your organs just violently shut down. You die, frozen solid, before the sun even fully sets.
It's terrifying. But it's a brutal physiological reality. When we look at the raw metrics of the human body, we are fundamentally tropical animals, right?
Oh, absolutely. We evolved in the heat of Africa to dissipate warmth, not to retain it. I mean, we sweat. We are largely hairless. We are entirely the wrong organism to survive a deep freeze.
And yet, for hundreds of thousands of years, that lethal frozen wasteland wasn't some nightmare scenario. It was everyday life.
Yeah, it was just Tuesday for them.
Right. Your ancestors lived through relentless, brutal ice ages where massive, mile-thick sheets of ice sat heavily on top of Europe, Asia, and North America. And somehow, against all staggering biological odds, they made it.
They really did, which is amazing.
You, listening to this deep dive right now, you are living, breathing proof of that. Every single one of your ancestors won a desperate war against winter that they absolutely could not afford to lose.
Which brings us to the core mission of our analysis today. It is arguably the most remarkable survival story in the history of our species.
It really is. We are dissecting how a completely ill-equipped, soft-skinned primate managed to engineer its way out of extinction.
And while we are definitely going to explore the massive architectural feats and, the mastery of fire, the real focus of this deep dive, the true hinge point of human survival, is one specific, almost microscopic technological leap.
Yes, exactly. We are tracking the monumental shift from early humans merely throwing loose animal hides over their shoulders to engineering fully tailored, multi-layered clothing.
Using bone needles.
Right, because that one tiny invention didn't just keep us warm. It fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of the human race.
It was the ultimate paradigm shift. I mean, without the transition to tailored clothing, the other survival mechanisms like fire and shelter would have essentially trapped us.
The needle was the mechanism of our liberation from the hearth. But before we dissect the solution, we have to really understand the sheer magnitude of the problem.
We have to look at the peak of the last ice age, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago.
Yeah, and realize just how profoundly unmatched we were for the environment. I'm looking at the climate data from this era, and it wasn't just cold. It was a completely alien landscape compared to what we know today.
The term archaeologists use for this environment is the Mammoth steppe.
The Mammoth steppe. Okay, paint a picture of that for us.
Well, picture a massive, dry, frigid grassland stretching all the way from modern-day Spain across Eurasia to Canada. It was incredibly dry because so much of the Earth's water was locked up in these massive ice sheets.
So no massive forests or anything?
No, trees were practically non-existent. The landscape was flat, frozen, and completely exposed to punishing, vicious winds that swept across the continents with, well, absolutely nothing to break their momentum.
Wow. And in that environment, you have animals that were built from the ground up for the freeze. You've got mammoths walking around with complex double-layered coats of fur.
Right, a coarse outer layer to shed snow and a dense undercoat to trap heat. Plus, like, a 4-inch layer of solid blubber.
A 4-inch layer of blubber. And you have cave bears with the physiological cheat code to just shut down their metabolism and hibernate through the most lethal months. Nature engineered them perfectly.
And then there's us.
Yeah, then there's us.
We arrived with nothing but a high-functioning cerebral cortex. We had no blubber. We had no undercoat.
Our physiological response to cold is basically limited to shivering, right?
Yeah.
Which violently burns through our glycogen stores just to generate a tiny bit of muscular heat.
Exactly. That and vasoconstriction, where the body basically sacrifices the fingers, toes, and nose just to keep the heart and brain warm.
It feels like the ultimate biological mismatch. I keep coming back to this analogy. Imagine you are a deep-sea diver, And you need to take a highly complex piece of computing technology down to the crushing depths of the Mariana Trench.
Okay, I like where this is going.
But instead of placing it in a heavily pressurized titanium deepwater casing, you just take a sleek, bare smartphone out of your pocket and drop it into the ocean.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. That is the human body in the Ice Age.
Uncased, fragile, and completely unsuited for the ambient pressure of the environment. Okay, let's unpack this. On paper, we were the first things that should have died. Wrong body, wrong place, worst possible time.
But the uncased smartphone analogy works because the processing power, the human brain, is unparalleled. The physical hardware was entirely wrong for the environment, yes.
But the processor made up for it.
Exactly. The only reason that smartphones survived the crushing depths of the Ice Age is because the processor figured out how to build its own titanium casing out of the environment itself. Lacking biological defenses, we had to artificially manufacture them.
So let's look at version 1.0 of human survival, the very first drafts of not freezing to death. Because long before anyone is threading a needle and tailoring a winter coat, you have to master the absolute baseline of thermodynamics.
Right, you need external heat. We know early hominids were using fire hundreds of thousands of years before the peak of this last ice age.
But when the Mammoth steppe expanded and the glaciers locked the world down, fire stopped being just a tool for cooking, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It became the entire anchor of human existence. It shifted from a utility to a life support system.
But the Mammoth steppe presented an immediate existential problem for fire building, the complete absence of wood. You cannot sustain a localized human population in negative 30-degree weather if your only fuel source is sparse, frozen scrub brush.
So they engineered a new fuel. Archaeologists excavating Ice Age hearths in modern-day Ukraine didn't find the remains of wood fires. They found meticulously structured fireplaces built entirely out of animal bones.
Specifically, massive mammoth bones. And what fascinates me is the chemistry of this. Because, I mean, if you throw a dry soup bone into a campfire today, it doesn't burn. It just chars and eventually cracks. So how are they using bone as a primary fuel source?
Well, it requires a profound understanding of combustion and the specific anatomy of the animals they were hunting. They weren't just throwing dry, hollow bones into a flame.
What were they using then?
They were utilizing the spongy, cancellous bone, specifically the massive joints and vertebrae of mammoths, which were completely saturated with dense, lipid-rich bone marrow and grease.
Oh, wow. So they were burning the internal animal fat trapped inside the skeletal structure itself.
Precisely. Bone doesn't burn easily. It requires a massive initial heat source to ignite, often using whatever small amounts of wood, dried dung, or tinder they could scavenge.
But once it gets going,
Once the heat penetrates the bone and the internal marrow catches fire, the bone acts as a structural wick. It burns incredibly slow, and it burns intensely hot.
how hot are we talking?
Chemical analysis of these ancient Ukrainian hearths reveals that they were achieving sustained temperatures upwards of 600 degrees Celsius.
Over 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. Just for context, the listener's modern kitchen oven probably tops out around 500 or 550 degrees.
Yeah, it's staggering.
These early humans were generating blast furnace levels of heat out on the open tundra using the skeletal remains of megafauna. That heat kept them alive at night. It allowed them to thaw frozen meat, and it hardened their stone tools.
But there is a glaring, fatal flaw in relying entirely on a 1,100-degree bone fire.
You are geographically tethered to it.
Exactly. You can't put a campfire in your pocket.
Yeah.
The second you step 100 yards away from that hearth to hunt, scout, or gather water, the ambient air immediately starts stripping the heat from your body.
Right. To survive, you have to move. So version 1.5 of survival was stealing the biological adaptations of the animals around us.
If you cannot grow your own thermal insulation, you flay it off an animal that can. And the archaeological record shows us doing this incredibly early.
We have physical evidence from Northern Europe, right? Specifically cut marks precisely located on the paw bones of bears, dating back at least 300,000 years.
Yes. Those cut marks are the exact incisions a hunter has to make to cleanly pull a heavy pelt off the carcass.
So early humans are taking these massive, dense bear skins and essentially draping them over their shoulders like heavy capes.
But let's break down the physics of a draped hide, because it is nowhere near as effective as people think.
Yeah, if I am walking across a frozen tundra with a heavy bear skin thrown over my shoulders, why am I still freezing to death?
Because you are fighting the laws of fluid dynamics and convection. A draped skin is an open thermodynamic system. The human body is constantly radiating heat, right?
Right.
In a draped configuration, that warm air rises and escapes out the top, out the sides, and from underneath. Furthermore, every time you take a step, move your arms to throw a spear, or every time a vicious gust of wind hits you, the hide physically lifts and shifts.
It creates a bellows effect. It violently pumps the warm air away from your skin and replaces it with sub-zero air.
Exactly. A draped hide might block the radiant loss of heat directly from your back, and it might stop snow from hitting your skin, but it is deeply vulnerable to convective heat loss.
You are leaking metabolic energy faster than you can generate it.
Yes. To survive the deep cold, to actually conquer the Mammoth steppe, early humans needed to close the system. They needed to stop the drafts.
They needed a vacuum seal.
Which brings us to the true focal point of our analysis today, the most monumental technological leap of the Ice Age.
The bone needle.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We think of the great inventions of antiquity as the wheel, the written word, agriculture. But around 30,000 years ago, an invention appeared that fundamentally altered human history. And it is almost microscopic. The bone sewing needle.
What's fascinating here is that it is difficult to overstate how revolutionary it was. A thin, fragile sliver of carved bone or ivory featuring a microscopic eye meticulously drilled through one end.
That single tool completely shifted the human operating system from crude survival to environmental dominance. I want to pause and appreciate the sheer mechanical difficulty of manufacturing a bone needle 30,000 years ago.
It wasn't easy. You don't have metal tools. You are working with ivory, which is incredibly dense and prone to splintering. To make the needle, you have to carefully carve and grind a tiny splinter of bone against a rock until it's perfectly smooth.
But the real genius is the eye of the needle.
Yeah, how are they drilling a hole that small without shattering the bone?
It requires microscopic precision and specialized stone tools called microborers. They had to nap tiny, sharp points of flint and painstakingly rotate them back and forth by hand.
Just back and forth over and over.
Exactly. Drilling from one side of the bone, then flipping it over and drilling from the exact opposite side until the two tiny craters met in the middle. The failure rate must have been incredibly high.
I can't even imagine the patience.
Yeah.
And once they had the needle, they had to manufacture the thread.
Peeling away the long, tough sinews along the spine of a reindeer, drying them, and pounding them into incredibly strong, fine fibers.
The labor investment is massive. But the payoff is the greatest thermal technology the world had ever seen: tailored clothing. A needle allows you to take complex geometries of animal hide and sew them tightly together.
It allows you to create sleeves. It allows you to seal the seams. It allows you to tailor the garment specifically to the contours of the human body.
And by doing so, you change the physics of human survival. Fitted clothing creates a permanent, stable microclimate.
When a garment closely hugs the body and the seams are physically bound shut with sinew, it traps a boundary layer of air right against the skin.
And the body's metabolism warms that thin layer of trapped air. Because the wrists, the neck, and the ankles are sealed, that warm air cannot escape via convection.
The coat isn't what keeps you warm. Your own body heat keeps you warm. The tailored coat just traps the heat you are already radiating.
Precisely. You have essentially constructed a wearable, insulated room. And I want to deeply contrast the mobility this afforded because it is staggering.
Yes, think about the hunter.
Right? Imagine a hunter wrapped in a clumsy, heavy bearskin cape trying to sprint, throw a spear, or track an animal. The cape is flapping, cold air is rushing in, their arms are exposed, and they are clumsy.
They're essentially fighting their own clothing.
Exactly. Now imagine an Ice Age human in tightly fitted leather pants, layered upper garments securely tied at the waist, tailored sleeves, and a hood. Perhaps the fur is turned inward against the skin for maximum insulation, and a second hide is facing outward to break the wind.
They have full range of motion, they are agile, they can leave the fire for hours or days at a time. The needle essentially unlocked the entire map of the frozen world.
And the tailoring didn't stop at the torso. The archaeological evidence shows a massive diversification of survival gear. They utilize specific animal hides for specific engineering purposes.
They favor deer or reindeer hide for extremities because it possesses a remarkable quality. It remains soft, pliable, and incredibly wind-resistant even at sub-zero temperatures.
Right, you can't have stiff frozen leather on your feet or you wouldn't be able to walk. So they engineered complex, soft-soled, waterproof boots, often stuffing the inside with dried grasses or moss for added insulation.
And they crafted tightly fitted mittens, too.
But what fascinates me most is how they protected the exposed skin of their face. You can't put a leather mask over your nose and mouth because the moisture from your breath would instantly freeze to the hide and cause severe frostbite.
That would be a disaster.
Yeah.
So they used biology. Before heading out into the wind, hunters would take tallow, which is heavily rendered, purified animal fat, and thickly coat their faces and necks.
It is an incredibly sophisticated understanding of lipid barriers. Freezing wind is a desiccant, right?
Hmm.
It violently strips moisture away from the skin, which accelerates conductive heat loss and leads directly to frostbite.
By applying a thick layer of tallow, they created a hydrophobic or water-repelling barrier. It physically sealed the pores, trapped the skin's moisture underneath, and allowed the biting wind to slide over the surface of the fat rather than penetrating the dermal layer.
It's like applying a heavy-duty biological petroleum jelly before an extreme alpine expedition. It might be a little grimy, but it completely arrests the flash freezing of facial tissue.
And they solved problems that go beyond just temperature. Out on the Mammoth Steppe, when the sun is reflecting off hundreds of miles of unbroken snow, you are exposed to immense, concentrated ultraviolet radiation.
Oh, the glare.
The glare can literally burn your retinas, causing snow blindness, which out on the tundra is an absolute death sentence. You cannot hunt, navigate, or avoid predators if your corneas are scorched.
So they engineered a mechanical solution to an optical problem. They invented snow goggles.
Yes, out of bone.
They took small, curved pieces of bone or wood, carved them to fit the exact contours of their face, and then sliced microscopically thin slits horizontally across the center.
By tying these over their eyes, they drastically restricted their field of vision. The tiny slits allowed just enough ambient light in so they could track prey and navigate the terrain, while physically blocking 90% of the reflective UV radiation from entering the eye.
It's just phenomenal. Lacking biological defenses, they used their hands and their minds to build solutions.
But tailored clothing, tallow, and bone goggles are active survival tools. They work perfectly when the human body is moving, generating metabolic heat, and maintaining that trapped microclimate.
But inevitably, as the sun goes down, the temperature plummets even further, and the human body needs to sleep. When you stop moving, your metabolic heat generation drops significantly.
Which means the tailored coat is no longer enough. The microclimate begins to cool. And out on the flat tundra, as we established, there are practically no caves and barely any trees to break the wind.
So how do you construct a fortress against the cold when you have absolutely no traditional building materials?
You turn back to the very resource that fuels your fires. You use the architecture of giants.
The Mammoth bone houses. This is where early humans transitioned from survivalists to civil engineers. There's a specific site called Mezirish, located in what is now Ukraine and Russia, dating back roughly 18,000 years, right in the absolute brutal climax of the last ice age.
And archaeologists uncovered the remains of massive, circular domestic structures, built almost entirely out of hundreds of mammoth bones.
And we're not talking about a crude windbreak or a pile of bones. The structural integrity and architectural complexity of these dwellings are astonishing.
The skull of a full-grown mammoth can weigh hundreds of pounds. The builders used these massive skulls, along with the dense, heavy leg bones, as a deeply anchored foundation. They sank them into the frozen earth to withstand the immense lateral pressure of the tundra winds.
Then, they utilized the natural curvature of the materials. They took the massive, sweeping mammoth tusks and the long ribs, interlocking them at the top to create a domed, arched roof frame.
You are looking at a structure that required the skeletal remains of dozens of individual mammoths to construct a single home. It's a staggering logistical feat just to move those bones, let alone engineer them into a dome.
Once the skeletal frame was erected, they had to insulate it. A bone frame does nothing to stop the wind. So they excavated the interior floor, sinking the living space partially below ground level.
Then they heavily packed the exterior bone frame with thick layers of animal hides, dense turf, and moss. They were deliberately creating highly insulated, thick walls designed to capture and retain the massive radiant heat generated by the internal bone fires we discussed earlier.
They even engineered chemical sealants. For the tiny micro gaps where the hides met the bone, they packed in mud and pine pitch, the incredibly sticky, resinous sap from pine trees acting as an ancient, airtight caulking.
But the absolute masterstroke of this architecture, the detail that proves they intuitively understood advanced physics, is how they designed the door.
The cold trap doorway. Wait, I'm obsessed with this detail. They figured out fluid dynamics and thermodynamics tens of thousands of years before we wrote it down.
Yes, it is a brilliant manipulation of fluid dynamics.
Because if you just cut a hole in the side of a tent, the wind blows straight in and freezes you. So instead, they dug the entrance tunnel significantly lower than the elevated sleeping platform inside the house.
Because cold air is physically denser and heavier than warm air. So any freezing air that entered the tunnel would pool in that dugout trench. It would just sit there in the basin.
Like a reverse chimney.
Exactly, or a thermodynamic moat. Meanwhile, the warm air radiating from the hearth naturally rose and pooled around the elevated platform where the families were actually sleeping. They built an invisible wall of dense, pooled, cold air at the entrance that physically prevented external drafts from sweeping across the floor.
They were manipulating the thermal properties of gases.
Mhm.
It's wild. And they manipulated the environment outside the home, too. They actively used snow as a primary building material, which to a modern listener sounds incredibly counterintuitive. Why would you pile freezing snow up against the walls of your house to stay warm?
Because snow, particularly fresh or lightly packed snow, is an extraordinary thermal insulator. It's composed of ice crystals that trap millions of microscopic pockets of air. Air is a terrible conductor of heat.
So it arrests conductive heat transfer.
Precisely. Therefore, a thick wall of snow physically arrests conductive heat transfer. So, if the ambient air whipping across the tundra is -30 degrees, the temperature buried deeply inside the snowbank, right up against the mammoth hides, is hovering steadily around 0 degrees.
They were using snow to effectively raise the baseline temperature of their exterior walls by 30 degrees. It's the exact same thermal logic as an igloo, utilized to lock the heat of the bonfire inside the structure.
So we have the fire, the tailored clothing, and the mammoth bone architecture. They engineered their way out of freezing to death. But stopping the immediate cold only wins you the night.
Right. Winter possesses a secondary, much slower and far more insidious killer.
Hunger, the slow killer.
You can survive the night in a mammoth house, but freezing will kill you in hours. Starvation kills you in weeks. And when the deep winter sets in, the entire landscape goes metabolically dormant.
The plants are dead under the snow. The herds of reindeer and wild horses migrate away or become terrifyingly scarce.
How do you fuel the human metabolic furnace when there are no calories left on the landscape?
This is where we see a fundamental psychological divergence between modern humans and Ice Age humans. For a modern individual, a severe winter storm that knocks out the power and empties the grocery shelves is an unpredictable emergency.
We operate on the baseline assumption of abundance.
Exactly. For Ice Age humans, winter was a guaranteed lethal siege. It wasn't an emergency, it was a scheduled event. Their entire existence, their spring, summer, and fall, was completely dictated by the logistical preparation for winter.
Think about the raw caloric math of this existence. How many calories does it take to keep a human alive in the freezing cold? A modern adult sitting at a desk might burn 2,000 to 2,500 calories a day.
An Ice Age hunter, wearing heavy layered clothing, wading through deep snow, shivering and dragging heavy carcasses back to camp in sub-zero temperatures, might be burning 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day, just to keep the internal organs functioning.
That requires a colossal intake of dense proteins and fats, which means zero waste was mandatory, and their hunting strategies couldn't just be about catching a single animal for dinner.
It had to be mass industrial harvesting. The caloric demand required highly coordinated logistical operations. We see profound evidence of this in eastern France, near massive, naturally occurring limestone rock formations.
What were they doing there?
The archaeological record indicates that generation after generation, for tens of thousands of years, hunters returned to these exact geological traps.
They used the landscape as a weapon. They didn't just chase individual animals. Entire communities utilized fire, shouting, and intense coordination to deliberately panic massive herds of reindeer and wild horses.
Driving them into dead-end canyons or forcing them off the edge of these steep limestone cliffs. They were executing mass casualty events specifically to hoard calories.
Because a kill of that magnitude wasn't meant to be eaten immediately. It was meant to be processed. The cold environment, which was their greatest enemy, became their primary tool for preservation.
They systematically butchered these massive herds, utilizing every single fiber of the animal. Zero waste was an absolute biological mandate.
The bones fueled the fires and built the homes. The hides were tailored into the microclimates using the bone needle. The fat was rendered for tallow to coat their faces, and the meat was relentlessly preserved.
They aggressively smoked meat over the hearths to draw out the moisture. They wine-dried it into tough jerky that would last for months without rotting.
They dug deep pits into the permafrost, creating subterranean cellars where the stable, freezing temperature of the earth protected the caches from surface scavengers like wolves and bears. But the most ingenious preservation method, the true Ice Age refrigerator, involved water.
Yes, the submerged caches. There is strong archaeological evidence suggesting they took massive quantities of meat, particularly heavy mammoth cuts, anchored them with heavy stones, and intentionally sank them into shallow, freezing ponds or peat bogs.
Which sounds crazy until you realize the biology behind it. By submerging the meat in freezing water, they created an anaerobic environment. They cut off the oxygen supply.
And without oxygen, the aerobic bacteria that typically cause meat to rot and putrefy cannot survive. The cold water preserves the tissue, and the lack of oxygen keeps it effectively fresh.
They were weighing down hundreds of pounds of calories in icy water to create a natural, fail-proof freezer that required no electricity and couldn't be destroyed by a blizzard.
It is a profound testament to their forward-thinking intellect. However, we must also acknowledge the brutal reality of the mammoth steppe. Despite the mass kills, the submerged freezers, and the smoked jerky, the margin for error was non-existent.
A sudden, prolonged freeze, an unexpected shift in animal migration, or a cache raided by cave hyenas could instantly plunge a community into a severe caloric deficit.
And when the preparation failed and the starvation set in, the survival instincts turned completely primal. We have to impartially look at the facts of what extreme starvation does to an isolated population.
When the food caches were completely empty, and the alternative was the total extinction of the family unit, the archaeological record shows undeniable evidence of cannibalism. We just have to report this factually.
It is a dark yet biologically necessary facet of this deep dive. We find human bones from this era bearing the exact same systematic butcher marks, marrow extraction, and rendering patterns as reindeer or mammoth bones.
This was not a ritualistic or cultural practice in these specific contexts, right?
No, it was the ultimate, desperate biological override. When the environment eliminates every other caloric option, a starving organism will consume whatever protein is available to sustain its core functions.
It strips away all the romanticism of the era. It was a violent, terrifying existence. So we've established how they survived using external engineering, the tailored coats, the mammoth bone moats, the mass harvesting. We used our massive brains to artificially build our way out of the deep freeze.
But what if we didn't? What if some humans tried to survive not with bone eagles and architecture, but by fundamentally altering their own biology?
This takes us from the realm of external technology to the fascinating limits of human physiological adaptation. Because not every population had access to mammoth bones or the time to sew complex garments. Some populations had to rely heavily on the immediate biological resources at hand.
And the most abundant biological heat source they had was each other.
Right, let's talk about heat sharing. In modern society, we value privacy. We want our own rooms, our own space. In the Ice Age, physical isolation was a death sentence.
The human body is essentially a biological radiator, constantly emitting thermal energy. If you pack an extended family of 20 people into a deeply insulated, sunken mammoth bone house, the collective radiant heat of those bodies fundamentally alters the ambient temperature of the room.
The social structure became a survival mechanism. To sleep alone was to court hypothermia. You survived because you slept in a dense, shared pile of biological warmth. And this utilization of biological radiators persisted long after the Ice Age.
During the brutal, deep winters of medieval Europe and Russia, it was standard practice for peasants to bring their livestock, cows, sheep, goats, directly inside the ground floor of their homes.
Because a cow is basically a massive hay-fueled furnace. And because heat rises, the thermal energy generated by the livestock on the bottom floor naturally drifted up, warming the human living quarters above. You were utilizing animals not just for milk or meat, but as literal space heaters.
It is a highly efficient use of available thermodynamic resources. But even more remarkable are the human populations that adapted to extreme cold internally on a deeply physiological level without relying on extensive external garments.
Let's talk about the Yagan people.
Sure.
They historically populated Tierra del Fuego, an archipelago at the extreme southern tip of South America. It is a notoriously brutal, freezing, wind-whipped environment.
And yet, when European explorers first encountered them, they were shocked to find the Yagan surviving in this deep cold, wearing practically no clothing at all. Maybe a loose animal skin draped over one shoulder to block the immediate wind, but absolutely no tailored, fitted garments.
How does a human body survive that without freezing?
It demonstrates the incredible plasticity of human biology. Technological mastery. The coat saved us, but it forever locked us into being fragile, tropical animals underneath.
It makes you look at that winter jacket hanging by your door in a completely new light. It isn't just a piece of synthetic fabric or a fashion statement. That coat is the ancient technological reason you are soft, hairless, and awake all winter long. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Ice Age. Stay warm out there.